Please raise your hands if you can hear me. Now, I'd like to speak a little bit about some examples of the positions that some different Tibetan masters have about the mind-only school. Now, the first of these among them is the discussion of the distinction between the true image school and the false image school. Now, if we talk about the internal divisions of the mind-only school, it's said that we're primarily talking about the differentiation between the true image and the false image school. Now, some say that the distinction between the two is whether they assert that the true appearances are true or real in being the character of mind, those are the true image, or whether the experiences are projective mind, they are they are the false image. Alternatively, it can be said whether appearances of relative truth appear to a Buddha's wisdom or not. So in Dukkha's text on the schools, there are those who assert that the essence of mind does not stand by false, or the stainless false image, and those who assert that the stained are the false image. Now, in general, the terms true image and false image, as I mentioned the other day, do not really occur in the explanations of the early masters, including to Asanga and Vasubandhu, but they're not completely absent from India, or from the for they're actually used by Kamala Shilpa and by the elder Bodhibhadra and so forth. Likewise, there's also a commentary on the chorus of Manjushi's name said to be by Manchang Goswami. And it does distinguish between the false image and the true image, stained and unstained. But that text not only refutes the mind only, it also says that there are two different schools, the illusory and the non-abiding. And it says that the non-abiding is the middle way, is the logical one. So therefore, since Chandragombe is generally known to be mind only, so we have to look at whether this is actually written by Chandragombe. So he's known as the Chandragombe is known as mind only. So we have to look at some other scholar with the same name wrote it, or if someone borrowed Chandragombe's name in writing it. So we still need to discuss with it which of these it was. In any case, the terms the true image and false images do have a source, but the question of who is true image and who is false image is not clearly identified in the Indian texts. Now, the earliest clear identification of the true image and false image that I've seen, the earliest text I've seen, is a text on the philosophical schools by Chachikawa Yeshe Dorje. So he wrote it in his text on the schools. So what he says is that the Dignaga, Dharmadaka, Dharmapala, Paranyakara Gupta, Jnanamitra, and so forth are a true image. And they assert that there are 6 consciousnesses. And the false image schools includes Asanga, Vasubandu, and Shantipa, and they assert that there are the 8 consciousnesses. Likewise, Chumna wrote in his text on the philosophical schools, cites passages from the 20 verses in the ascertainment of validity to show that Vasubandhu and Dharmakirti both had aspects of both a true and false image positions. Taksan Losor writes that Asanga and his disciples did not distinguish between true image and false image, but their explanations are more concordant with the false image school. The difference between true and false image occurred later after Vasubandhu and Asanga. Also, within the true image school, they're also divided into the split egg, the equality of apprehender and apprehended, and the non-dual plurality, these 3 different traditions. Now, some scholars say that this was invented by Tibetans. That was not said in India. There are people who do say this. But it is difficult to categorically say that it was not at all, that these did not occur at all in India. The reason for this is that in Shantarakshita's ornament of the middle way, all 3 of these are discussed in the passages on the Sutra of the Mind-Only School. Likewise, Taksan Losar writes in his Knowledge of All Schools, he described how the positions of each of these 3 schools were found in India, and he cites passages from undisputed, well-known texts to prove this. So it's difficult to say that there weren't any divisions of the true image school in India, but primarily the most clearly way that the division, the mind only is divided in Tibet. So there's no real explanation of this in Tibet, and it's not at all clear and very complicated. So I think this is one reason why the mind-only philosophy is not very clear. Now there is also, to give a Geluk presentation of this, because I think later I can explain it in detail. But I think that if we understand the Chinese tradition, then we can understand the difference better. And so I think it'll be beneficial because it's not clear in the Tibetan texts. So where did it go? So in the Chinese tradition, the way the false image or non-imagist school is explained, you can take it either, you can explain it in terms of either greater understanding or a more narrow understanding. And to talk about it in the narrow way is that the consciousness itself arises from the seeds of the ground consciousness, and therefore it is dependent nature. But the image of the consciousness has two parts, the subject and the aspect. There's a subjective aspect and the objective aspect. These two. These are the apprehender and the apprehended. And everything that is apprehended and apprehended is imaginary. Because it's imaginary, it is therefore a confused appearance and does not exist in actuality. It's a confused appearance. So basically, everything that appears to cognition and the cognition to which it appears and that which appears to it. And so the cognitive images of these are all confusion. They're all imaginary. They're merely confused appearances and do not exist in actuality. And so that's one way of explaining the false image school. Now, a broader way of explaining it is that the apprehending aspect of consciousness is cognition itself. So it is dependent. But the apprehended aspect or the image of the external object is imaginary, and therefore it is confused. And so in that turn, that is another explanation. So if we take the broader understanding of the way that consciousness does not have to describe how the images are not real, there is a broader way of understanding it or a narrower way. Now, for the true image school and so forth, is how is it explained in the true image school or the imagist school? Is that both the subjective and objective aspects of mind are both dependent. And so both of these aspects, the subjective and the objective aspects, are dependent, and therefore, for that reason, the aspects of subjective and objective images do not have an imaginary nature. So this is the position in the Indian schools. So we generally say in Tibetan that all mind-only masters assert that the mind truly exists. And so this is actually a little bit overly broad. We say that if you're a mind only, that you have to assert that all cognitions are truly existent. That's not true. It's not necessarily so. For example, so if you have all of the apprehensions of external apprehensions of entities, all cognitions of apprehensions of appearance of entities are all imaginary. So even within the false image, there are two different positions. There's a position that says that the appearances of external objects are imaginary, and so they say that they're not necessarily so, as it says in the 30 verses. Even though there's no external mind, it says that there is an internal mind. If we continue to attach to that, then it says that we don't actually get to the ultimate view of the mind only. And so these are all sort of general explanations, and we talk about general explanations. Therefore, for people with childish minds, and so I think that's an explanation for that. And so it's like there's a very clear explanation, the difference between the true image and false image in Chinese tradition, and a more complete. And this is something that we, among our Tibetans, and within Tibetans, we have many different positions, and I think that because they bring it up into a single whole, then it's beneficial for us to understand this. Now, one way that the mind-only school is classified is into the followers of scripture and the followers of logic. So this is another position, right? And this tradition later had an influence in China. And so Chinese traditions said that this is the Tibetan position, is that they're the followers of scripture and the followers of logic. So they began to use these terms as well. But in the old times in China, there was probably no discussion of the followers of scripture and followers of logic. In any case, when we talk about the followers of scripture and the followers of logic, this primarily comes from Sangha and others who follow the 5 sets of levels, the Yogacara levels. And also, the examples of the ladders would include Dignog and Dharmakirti and so forth. And so we'd say that those are followers of logic. This is what's generally said. As I said before, this is similar to the division into earlier and later mind only in Chinese Buddhism. So there's some similarity to that between that and the explanation of the followers of scripture and the followers of logic. Now, the reason for this is that what Takson Logtawa says is the Dignaga and his disciples did not accept the ground consciousness and so forth. So they only asserted the six consciousnesses. This is one position that is well known in Tibet. But the Travasalanka Sutra and the Sutra Unraveling the Tent teach the ground consciousness. There's no mind-only master who would not accept this. And if we look at the works of Dignaga and Dharmakirti, the reason why the ground consciousness is not taught is that it's just not related to the topic and is therefore not taught. But you cannot say that this means they do not accept it. Rather, they just did not explain its reasons at length. And so for this reason, Dignaga and Dharmakirti are often said not to accept only the six consciousnesses, but this is not categorically so. Likewise, there is a text of Dignagas that's cited by Vimalagupta that engages in consciousness, the ground consciousness, and Devendra and Buddha and Shakyamuni. These commentaries on the commentary on the validity clearly mention the ground consciousness. In particular, Shakyamuni explains the meaning of sentient beings each having an individual continuum of consciousness. And he says that this refers to the ripening consciousness or the ground consciousness. And so he explains this clearly. Likewise, in Vinitadeva's commentary on Vasubandu's 20 verses and Dharmakirti's proof of other continuums clearly teach the ground consciousness and its imprints. So even within those the seven texts of validity and their proponents, there are some that mention that the ground consciousness and some that don't. So it's difficult to say that they don't teach the ground consciousness at all. Now, also if you look at Chankya Dorje and other Gelug scholars, please wait a moment. So Chankya Dorje and other Gelug scholars say that the followers of scripture and logic have positions of either the true image or the false image schools. So you cannot categorically say that they're one way or the other. So if we illustrate this one text, in the commentary on validity, Devendra Buddha and Shakyamuni explain it as true image, and Prajnakaragupta explains it as false image, and within that, the stainless image. And Master Dharmottara explains it as a stained false image, so it is not necessarily any one. Or else it is really not clearly presented, as Chankya Dorje explains. In Tibet, Gyaltsab J explains the commentary of validity says is a false image, mind-only text. But Kedab J says it is the true image, others are more solidly explained, and so it is the true image. Now, both of these are from the tradition of Tsongkhapa's teachings, so for this reason, it must be difficult to distinguish the subdivisions, the mind-only. So first, it's difficult to describe what is the true image and the false image. And so then within those to see what is the stained image or the false or the unstained image and stuff is also very difficult. And so, as I have explained before, the the treatises that are in Chinese, if we read these, are much clearer on this point. And so I think we can have some hope of gaining clarity from these texts. Next, in any case, when you talk about the texts well known in Tibet, then primarily we're speaking about the commentaries on the five dharmas of Maitreya. So if we want to understand what the mind-only view is, we then need to understand what the Maitreya's view. Now, the way we explain Maitreya's thought in Tibet, there are many different differing traditions, and there are many disagreements. For example, there are those who said that the ornament of sutras and differentiating the middle from extremes are mind only. Sublime continuing ornament of clear realization is middle way. And for the distinguishing phenomenon of dharmata, there are some who say it is mind only, and some who assert it as a secondary aspect of the sublime continuum and as middle way. And basically, those who assert the five dharmas of Maitreya are middle way are Dolpopa and Shakya Chokten. And the ones who assert that all five are mind only include Rindawa Shunulodra. But it said that Rindawa later went into retreat and realized that the sublime continuing is that its thought is middle way thought, as it is said. And this is related in the Blue Annals. And generally, there are fewer Tibetans who say that all five of the dharmas of Maitreya are mind only. Tsongkhapa says that the differentiating the middle from extremes and differentiating the phenomena and dharmata are mind only, as is the ornament of the sutra, but the ornament of clear realization is mostly autonomous and ultimately consequentialist in its view. And the sublime continuum is consequentialist middle way, he says. So in brief, the situation that occurred is that the dharmas of Maitreya spread, but the mind only did not. Now, actually, if we look at the sort of international consensus, the dharmas of Maitreya are mind-only texts. So the dharmas of Maitreya spread, and the mind only did not. So the situation in Tibet was different. The dharmas of Maitreya spread, but the mind only did not. And so the reasons they could not decide that they were mind only or middle way. Some people were unable to decide, or even if they decided, they said that they're all unilaterally or categorically middle way. And so this is another reason, I think, why the mind only did not flourish. Now, the main reason why the mind only did not flourish, or why they are asserted not to be the mind only, is the assertion that the consciousness is truly existent. Now, in the ornament of the sutras, and distinguishing in the middle from extremes and companion of mind, it is not clearly stated that consciousness truly exists. Therefore, from this perspective, you can find a way to say they are not mind-only schools. But if you look at Stiramata's commentary, it says that the mind is truly existent. This is very clearly explained. So most scholars say that, including say that Stiramata and Devendra Buddha and so forth are mind-only. Likewise, if we assert that appearances of mind, we must be mind only. But there's also it is not necessarily so. So there are differences. So there are different scholars' positions. And another difficult point is that whether they associate the dependent nature to be truly existent or not. Tsongkhapa says the mind only asserts that the dependent is truly existent. But in the mind only school, for the ultimate existence, there are the two traditions, whether the true existence exists by its own existence, or whether that which is determined to be the ultimate existence because it is the object of meditative wisdom. So in terms of it being truly existent by its own characteristics, if we emphasize that, then the Bodhisattva Lemels and the Companion of Mahayana explain that the dependent exists. And if we think about it in terms of whether it is the object of the meditative wisdom, then it would not be. Now, some scholars say that in the mind-only school, the dependent is not truly existent, and only the absolute is. For example, the Kamsam scholar Pelkang Lotsa says that the true image and the false image are the same in asserting that the imaginary does not exist. But the false image says that between the pure and impure dependent, in the true image, both the pure and impure dependent are relative, while the false image asserts that the pure dependent is ultimate. And so the positions on the dependent as to whether they assert the dependent to be truly existent or not. So this is another important point. So now I've got the. So now what I just said is a little bit mixed up. I've got the order a bit wrong. So now I'm speaking primarily about the spread of the dharmas of Maitreya into Tibet. As I said before, in Tibet, the dharmas of Maitreya spread, but the mind only did not. Or that the mind-only philosophy spread in the form related to the dharmas of Maitreya, but not as an actual self-standing mind-only school. So I thought I would like to speak about how the dharmas of Maitreya spread into Tibet in general. Now, during the ancient transmission period, not all 5 of the dharmas of Maitreya were translated. So that's how it was. So the term, the 5 dharmas of Maitreya, does not appear in the ancient transmission. It was later, during the later transition period, that it became well-known and undisputed. So this term, the 5 dharmas of Maitreya, became undisputed during that period. So when we say the 5 dharmas of Maitreya, what we say in Tibetan, when we say the 5 dharmas of Maitreya in Tibetan, the way we understand it is to mean the ornament of clear realization, ornament of the sutras, differentiating the middle from explains, differentiating phenomena and the dharmata, and the sublime continuum. The third Karmapa Ranjun Dorje notes that the other dharmas of Maitreya than the ornament of clear realization have no opening homage, and that the other dharmas of Maitreya, other than sublime continuum, don't have dedications. So for this reason, you say that these 5 dharmas of Maitreya are different sections, but they're actually one thing. It's all part of the same big treatise. And so that is the situation. They're not, they're just different sections, but they're part of the body of a large work. Now, Shakya Chokan says to this that the homage of the clear realization is an homage to that work only. And the sublime continuous dedication is the dedication of that work alone, but that does not make them all into one work. Likewise, some Gelug scholars raise the question that, like, for example, the 32 marks and so forth are taught in both the ornament of clear realization, the sublime continuum. And so if teaching it in the ornament of clear realization was enough, there'd be no reason to teach the sublime continuum and so forth. And so there'd be the fault of redundancy and so forth. In any case, among the 5 dharmas of Maitreya, the ornament of clear realization, the ornament of sutras, and differentiating the middle from extremes were translated during the ancient transmission, and this is very clear if we look at the ancient catalogs. Now, the differentiating phenomenon, dharmata, and the sublime continuum do not appear in the ancient catalogs. According to Gulatsa Shinopal's Blue Annals, and many other histories, what it says is that differentiating the phenomenon dharmata and the sublime continuum were not known in Tibet. But even at that time in India, they were not well known. And the reason he gives for this is that the works by Indian masters such as Vasubandu quote very liberally from the other dharmas of Maitreya, but they don't have even a single quote from differentiating phenomena and dharmata and the sublime continuum. Likewise, there's the story of Maitreya seeing a golden light come from a stupa and finding the texts of these works. And what this shows is that the sublime continuum and differentiating the phenomena and the dharmata were very rare in India. So I think this shows that they're extremely rare texts in India. So it seems that the situation in India was that they're extremely rare texts. However, but it is difficult to say categorically that the sublime continuum, that there was no text of the sublime continuum and no text of the differentiating phenomena and dharmata. So saying that would be very difficult. If we think about differentiating phenomena and the dharmata, it was not translated into Chinese in ancient times. In the 20th century, it was translated by the Chinese master Shupak into Chinese. So the differentiating phenomena and dharmata could be said not to have been well known in Chinese, but the sublime continuum, or distinguished the family of the jewels, was translated, had already been translated into Chinese around the 6th century. Before it was translated into Tibetan, it was translated into Chinese. And so before the ancient transmission of the Dharma actually even began in Tibet. And in Chinese, what it says in Chinese Buddhism is that the distinguishing the family of the jewels was written by Sthiramati. So it's other than attributing it to a different author, the text itself did exist in India before that time. Now, the first translation of the Sublime Continuum into Tibetan was by Atisha and Natsalo. So Atisha was the scholar, and Natsalo did the actual translation. Then the most common and the most widespread translation of the Sublime Continuum was the one by Ngotlo Loden Shera. But when we talk about the origins of the Sublime Continuum, the most well-known story is the story passed on from Tsin Kaoche. The one from there's a very clear transmission story about the transmission of the Ngotlo Tsao and Loden Shera. Excuse me. Now, so the tradition, what it says in this account of the origin of the Sublime Continuum is that for many, they're hidden for a long time. It's like a treasure, and no one could see them. And most Indian scholars, and basically no scholars at all, knew about them or had read them. And then at one point, Maitripa saw a golden light shining from between the bricks of a stupa, and what he understood then is that he went and he looked at the golden light, and he's found these two texts, the Sublime Continuum and differentiating phenomena from the Dharmata. And when he found them, then he supplicated Maitreya, because Maitreya is the author. He supplicated at Maitreya. He had a vision of Maitreya appearing to him in the sky, riding on a cloud, and gave the transmission of them to Maitreya. Maitreya then had a student named Gawadrapa, or Nandakirti, perhaps. So Nandakirti later went to Kashmir, like a Kashmir, right? He went to Kashmir, and he gave it to Sejana. So later, Ngotlo Tsao and Tsin Kaoche, they're two translators, right? They're both students of Drapa Ngönshe. And they went to Kashmir together. Now, Ngotlo Tsao studied many different texts, but Tsin Kaoche basically only studied the Dharmas of Maitreya. And he returned to Tibet before Ngotlo Tsao returned. So he had already returned to Tibet, and he spread the teaching that primarily the sublime continuum. And so from that time, the meditative tradition on the five dharmas of my chair arose from that, it is said. So if we look at the histories, we only see the story about how it was passed down to Tsen Kaoche. We don't see the story about how it was passed down to Ngolo Tsawa. Now, after Tsen Kaoche had gone to Tibet, then Ngolo Tsawa also translated the sublime continuing a differentiating phenomena and Dharmata. So before Ngolo Tsawa's translation appeared, the Kadampa masters primarily used, when they were studying the Sublime Continuum, they primarily used the text that was the version that was translated by Atisha Ngotso Lok. But after Ngolo Tsawa's translation appeared, most people preferred it, and because they preferred it, even the Geshe Shaodacha criticized its students. This is why you're looking at not looking at the text translated by the great master Atisha and looking at some translation by some Acharya Ngotlo Tsao, and you can criticize the students for it. Now, with the Sublime Continuum, there's not only the Ngotlo Tsao translation, there's also translations by Potso Tsao, Yarlong Tsao, Dapa Gyaltsum, and others. They also made new translations of the Sublime Continuum into Tibetan. But in our current tradition, other than the Ngotlo Tsawa translation, the translations by Atisha and Ngotso Tsawa, as well as the translation of Patsap Tsawa and the Yarlong Tsawa Dapa Gyaltsum translations are probably no longer extant. And this is rather disappointing. From one point, it's understandable. When you're compiling the Kanjur and the Tenjur, when you have different versions of the same text, you can only include one text because otherwise it would be too expensive, right? To carve the blocks and everything. Take a lot of time and a lot of effort, and very difficulty, very expensive. So you choose one text and you include that. That was the tradition. These days, when you put everything in the computer, then it's not as much. If you put a little of effort and do it on the computer, then there's not so much difficulty in printing it. So these days, my plan is just with the Kanjur and the Tenjur, is to recompile a new Kanjur and Tenjur, and within that include, if there are differing translations of a text, we can include all the different translations. That's one plan. If we look at there are many texts that are in the handwritten Kanjurs that are not in the printed editions, and if we also compile those and make a complete Kanjur and a complete Tenjur, and if we make it a single edition, that's a thought that I've had. Likewise, within the Kanjur, the Avatam Sapaka and the Ratnakuta and many other sections, right? And among them, there's a separate section called the Dupachimbo section. It actually should be, it's a section of the Avatamsaka. Now the sutras within that are translated into Tibetan, but they aren't put in that section. So it seems like they made a new catalog of these. Likewise, there are also texts that weren't translated into Chinese, into Tibetan. Texts that are in Sanskrit or Pali or Chinese, and if we translate as many of them as possible, and as if we can train some translators, and give them some offerings and so forth, that's a plan that I have. In any case, there the different versions translated by different translators, comparing their different versions is really beneficial for translators, for researchers. It's also very beneficial for the teachers when you're teaching Dharma. If it says this in this version, this in this translation. And so if you are able to explain this, then I think that it's definitely very beneficial. In any case, according to the account of Tsen Kao Che, if it is true that the sublime continuum and differentiated phenomena and Dharmata were not in India but were later revived in India, if that is true, then this is true, that Maitrepaya once again revived them. So if you take that as being true, now Atisha and Maitrepaya were contemporaries, and so they would have had to have some connection between the two, because it's not clear whether they had a connection as master and student. There would have had to have been some connection. So the question is, how would we'd have to have a question about how the text would have been translated from Maitrepaya to Atisha. Like, how did it happen? So what is Atisha's tradition? So either it goes passed down from Maitrepaya or it is not related to Maitrepaya, and that's a difference. If you have to say that there's a connection, you need a clear connection between the two. And so it'd be necessary to research whether the tradition of Vaichipa was related to that of Maitrepaya or not. Likewise, as differentiating the phenomenon Dharmata, there are two transitions. There's a transition by Atishan, not Lotsoa, and that's in prose, as it is said. But the text of the differentiated phenomenon Dharmata is in verse. This is the version that's well known. It is translated by Shama and Lotsoa. And if we look at the Sanskrit original, so that's translated by Shama Lotsoa. Now you have both a prose version and a verse version. So either there were Sanskrit originals in both prose and verse, but it is extremely, very difficult, hard to say that it would be translated from prose as verse. This is very rare to find that. So you have to see, how is it that one is in prose and one's in verse? Because Atisha's translation is in prose and Shama Lotsoa is in verse. And the one that we normally trend is Shama Lotsoa, Sunny Johnson was, in terms of philosophy, he was a student of Ngotlod and Shutup and many other translators. And in terms of pith instructions, he was a student of Dampa Sangye. Then he later went to the Five Peak Mountain in China and never returned to Tibet. Likewise, he was the translator of the Dighanaga's Compendium of Validity and its auto-commentary. Later, among the most important of the Indian masters who went to Tibet was Kashmir Pandita Shakrashri. And there were pith instructions taught by the Kashmiri Pandita Shakrashri and the five dharmas of Maitreya. And this is what is said. But this tradition has been lost. The lineage has been broken. In any case, that discusses the spread of the dharmas of Maitreya into Tibet in brief. So I've given an introduction into that now. Actually, there's something I should show. I think it's better to show you this. My explanation was not so clear. So this is the text on the earlier and the later transformations of the five dharmas of Maitreya. So I think that is basically it. So I don't have any else to say. Now tomorrow is a day off. The day after, I'll speak about the remainder of the topic of the spread of the mind only to Tibet. And then there's a question about the relations between the mind only and the middle way, the relations between the middle way and the Buddha nature school. Now, of course, I've already explained in brief the relation between the mind only and the middle way, so I should speak about that a little bit more. We shall speak a little bit more about the connection between the relation between the mind only and the Buddha nature school. And then after that, what is left to speak about is the six texts on. There are texts on the six sutras and the compilation of the treatises that are preserved in Chinese, and I should also speak about those. So now we will recite the closing prayers.